Good afternoon, class. I'm going to try this again. I did this entire lecture yesterday, probably an hour and a half. I did 2 chapters and disappeared. Disappeared into cyberspace. Don't know what happened. So I'm going to try this again. If it doesn't work, I'm going to type notes. So anyways, this is an entirely online class. We live in a crazy world where you can't get near people or you get some disease and die. So I know a lot of people in the online format, they fall behind the reading. They don't like reading very much. They fall asleep when they read. They underestimate how long it's going to take to read through chapters. I have done both modalities, face-to-face and online. I did a lot of grad school classes that were online. And I personally much more enjoying listening to somebody lecture the material. So for that reason, I'm going to give you the best of both worlds. I'm going to put all of the PowerPoints online. There will be some videos that are important that I think illustrate points. There will be links to those videos also in the classroom. And then I'm going to try to do the lectures through this medium, and I will then send the links out for each chapter. So every chapter I hope to do a video like this where I will run through the PowerPoint and just give a little clarity and a little bit of explanation. And if I do everything right, and I cover everything the way I intend to cover it, the way I cover it in class when I do this, you won't ever have to crack a textbook. Unless you just really don't understand something even after the video and the PowerPoint. If it still doesn't make sense, well, then maybe you need to reference the textbook and see what they have to say. But by and large, I hope that by the time you listen to what I say explaining the PowerPoint, you'll get it. You'll get it enough to do well in the exam, by the way. So, without further ado, without making this video overly long, quick introduction. Normally this is when in the class I introduce myself, then I go around the room and everybody sort of introduces themselves. And it's a great way to get to know who else in the room is interested in the same things that you are. Same major, maybe they work in a similar field right now. Maybe they want to work in a similar field in the future. And that's always good to know, but unfortunately we don't have that. So I'll give you a quick introduction for myself. Again, my name is Daniel Hageman, instructor for this course. I teach this class and I teach lifespan. Last semester I was at Sam Houston and I taught research methods and I taught history of psychology. I have also taught social psychology, probably a couple of other things that I'm forgetting at the moment. But yeah, so I've been doing this for a little bit. I enjoy it. I don't really look at it like a job. It's more like a hobby. I actually have a full-time job. This is just something I do on the side for vacation money. So I have a very different background than probably a lot of psychologists. I went to Sam Houston as a student. I graduated in 2000 with a degree in criminal justice, emphasizing police science and law enforcement, a degree in psychology, and a degree in general business with a minor in accounting. That was not on purpose. It was poor planning on my part. But anyway, I triple majored. I then went on to get my MBA. I started law enforcement in 2001, and I left at the end of 2009. And then I came back a little later, and I did like one more year. But I did everything in law enforcement that I really had set out to do. I was patrol. I was an FTO. I was an academy instructor. I was on the mobile field force. I was SWAT trained. I was warrant school trained. I was a property crimes liaison detective for thefts and small property crimes. That was kind of boring. But yeah, I'll have a lot of cop stories that illustrate some of the points that we talk about because that's what I know. That's my past. That's how I learn the best, is to hear an abstract concept and figure out a way to apply that to real life. And sometimes these, I have such kind of a wealth of stories from my law enforcement career that they lend themselves well to explaining some of these concepts that we're going to talk about. So I've done plenty of other things. I was a correctional officer. I worked for the government. I've been a manager at different places. I've worked in warehouses and waited tables. I mean, I've done pretty much most things that there are to do. So you'll hear me again talk about some of those experiences as they relate to the class. So anyway, if you have any questions about career paths or anything like that, this is normally where people throw those at me, but again, since I'm doing this talking to myself, you'll have to email me. So email me any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, ideas, anything that you might have. I'm going to try to stay on top of my email every day. So hopefully I'll get a response to you either that day or certainly by the next. All right? So hopefully you can see both this side of the screen and the other side of the screen, which hopefully will be the PowerPoint slides. As you can see, Chapter 1's only got 10 or 11 slides. In class, I usually go into a lot of depth in most of these, so it ends up being a couple of day-long lectures. I'm going to try to shorten that up. So we'll try to get through this in, I hope, like maybe 30 minutes or so. So, introduction to psychology. So the first thing that we have to talk about is, what is psychology? What does that word even mean? So that word comes from the Latin, the study of the soul is what that comes from. So are we going to study the soul? No. Clearly we have evolved. Our definitions have evolved. Most intro textbooks have a very, sometimes they try to be very concise with a definition, which I appreciate, but at the same time, if you're overly concise, then the definition has words in it that further need defining. So I'm not a big fan of that. So as you'll see, and I don't know what the current textbook reads because I haven't even looked at it. We do use a free textbook that's provided, I think, through Rice University. I'm pretty sure the link is in the syllabus, but now that I'm thinking about it, I might have left it off, so I'll have to make sure everybody gets the link to it. But I haven't even looked at the new edition of it yet. So I know that an old version defines psychology as the scientific study of the mind. Well, I don't like that. And part of the cool thing about having a PhD, the same as the author, is I can say, I don't like your definition sucks, and here's a better definition, and we're on the same level. So the reason that I don't like it is because what is mind? What is that? What does that even mean? If I ask 5 people, hey, what does it mean, the mind? Some people would say, your brain. Well, is brain and mind the same thing? Some would argue, yes, it's the same thing. They're synonymous. Other people would say, no, the brain is the physical structure, right? The mind is the more sort of intangible qualities, right? The processes that occur inside that physical structure. So I don't think that's a very clear definition, so I don't typically go with that. So my definition, still keeping it simple, the scientific study of behaviors and mental processes. Because really when you look at psychology as a field, that's the two things that we look at. We look at behaviors and we look at mental processes. Sometimes mental processes drive behavior. Sometimes certain behavior can lead to a certain mental process. So they're interrelated, but they're not necessarily correlated. They're correlated, but they're not causal. One doesn't cause the other all the time. Sometimes it works in the other direction. So we'll talk more about that as we go on. But that's pretty much, I think, the most simplistic definition that we can have that fully covers, I think, the entire field. So moving along, there's an argument as to whether or not psychology is a soft science or is it a hard science. Now, what is the difference between those two things? So a hard science would be something like chemistry, for instance. So in chemistry, you can mix 2 chemicals together in the proper proportions. You can add heat or whatever you need to add to create a chemical reaction and then get a new element, right? Or not an element, but a new compound. Well, it's observable. It's measurable. You can replicate it every single time. And it's not specifically to any particular lab or region or culture or country or whatever, right? A chemistry lab in America does the same thing as a chemistry lab in Japan. So it's a hard science because of all of those things. It follows the scientific method. We can see it, we can observe it, we can measure it, we can replicate it. We know what's going to happen. It's predictable. We put these 2 chemicals together, we get the same thing. Some would argue that math is the same thing. 1 + 1 is 2, no matter who you are, no matter where you are. 1 + 1 is always 2. So again, there's a however you say that, quality to that. Now, a soft science would be something like maybe philosophy. Philosophy is the study of thought. They have thought experiments. If a tree fell in the woods and nobody was around, does it still make a sound? And you argue, yes, it makes a sound because sound is created through sound waves, right? And those sound waves would occur, there would just be no receptor site for those sound waves to be processed. So then the argument is, well, then did they really exist? If they weren't received, did they exist? So it's a thought experiment. There's nothing really measurable to it, right? So where does psychology fit between soft sciences and hard sciences? Are there soft science components? Are there things that are studied that are not really tangible or observable? Well, sure. We can't measure mental processes. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, what about EKGs and things like that? You got all the stuff you can put on people's brains. You can measure neurological activity. But that's just the thing. That's what you're measuring is neurological activity, not necessarily mental processes. Sometimes all the gears are turning. They're not getting the right response, right? They're not doing what you expect them to do. They're not thinking the right thing. They're not solving the problem correctly, right? Wheels are turning, not really coming to the proper answers. So that's not what those machines measure. They don't measure necessarily mental processes. They measure physiological activity in the brain. Those are different things. So there is a soft science component because part of psychology is mental processes, and we can't see that. But another part of psychology is behaviors, and we can observe those. They are measurable to some extent. So my answer is that a hard science or a soft science it's neither. It has components of both, which by definition makes it neither. So it's more of a medium science, but they haven't created that category yet. So there's argument about whether we're soft or hard. I'm going to say that we're kind of both and neither at the same time. So that is always the mission of psychology. We were born from philosophy as a soft science, and we want that hard science title. So we do everything we can in our power to focus on that scientific method, the observable, the measurable, to be able to replicate things so that we're considered a hard science. We're not there yet, I don't think. Will we ever get there? Probably not. But don't tell all the lab coat people that because they're really trying hard to get us there. All right, so a couple other things. I'm going to skip down pop psychology. Pop psychology is stuff that basically purports to be psychology, but it's really not. It's a misapplication of theories or ideas that are overly simplified things, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes pop psychology is sort of based on some truth, but possibly exaggerated to some extent. So yeah, we're gonna dispel some pop psychology myths along the way. And then going back up, psyche. Psyche is a pop psychology term because it's not really used in the field. We don't use it in research much. It's not really mentioned unless it's a historical reference. It's not something that any psychologist or therapist will really use in a day-to-day conversation with a client or a patient. What does it mean? It means like the totality of the mind, basically mental processes. But it also sort of incorporates more than mental processes because it's also kind of taking into account emotions. Emotions are slightly different than mental processes. Cognitive and emotional sort of are intertwined but different, and this will make more sense later. But so psyche kind of talks about all of that, and it's a very vague word. Again, referring to both the emotional capacity and mental processes. It's kind of all mixed together. It's got a long history, but we've kind of gotten away from that to some extent. We kind of differentiate now between those two different things, and we don't use one collective term like psyche. So I feel like when you go through a class like Intro to Psychology, you should be at least introduced to these topics because, again, you'll watch a TV show and they'll use the word psyche and somebody says, hey, you took psychology, what does that mean? then you can tell them, well, it's not kind of an old word, it's a throwback word, we don't really use it very much. Now we sort of differentiate between mental processes and emotional feelings, things like that, but that word psyche kind of intertwined all of that. So, all right, let's go into the history a little bit. Oh, no, one more thing. 4 goals of psychology. So this is in the textbook. This is a very textbook thing, but we'll fly through it real quickly. The first goal of the field of psychology, psychologists, right, is to simply describe. We want to be able to identify and classify behaviors and mental processes as accurately as possible. So anytime you're going to describe, say, behaviors, right? Let's say you're going to do research and you're going to see if you showed a room of kids a fairly violent, maybe cartoon, and then you send them out to recess. Are they going to be more violent than if you took those same kids and on another day and they watched, My Little Pony or something, and then you sent them out to play? Are they going to be more violent, less violent, or equally violent? Maybe that's the research. So we would want to identify behaviors, right? And one of the things that we might do there is we would observe them play. But we would have to beforehand define what counts as aggressive behavior. If one kid runs up to another kid and goes, "You're a stupid head," and then runs off, is that aggressive? Well, some would argue, yeah, surely that's aggressive. If somebody did that to my kid, I'd be upset, and rightfully so. But, is watching a physically violent beat-em-up show, did that bring out verbal violence? Those are very kind of different things. So are they related? Are we going to include that in the measurement of aggression? That's something that researchers have to get together and figure out beforehand so they know whether or not to classify that behavior and describe it as aggressive. And it depends on the theory that you're operating under whenever you're setting aside research to do for that particular project. So we want to identify and classify both behaviors and mental processes as best we can. And again, that comes from sort of a collaborative effort, usually putting together whatever the research might be on that particular field, and how do you, the researcher, apply it to this question that you seek answers to. So that's describe. The next one, of course, is explain. And this is a proposal of reasons for behaviors and mental processes. So I do this constantly, right? Because, so as a psychologist, and we'll talk about this way later in the chapters, but there's a notion of normality, right? What is normal, right? Things that are abnormal get classified and you can be diagnosed. It used to be considered abnormal to be homosexual, for instance. That used to be classifiable mental disorder because it was considered to be not the norm. Well, then more and more people came out and openly admitted that they lived that lifestyle, and next thing you know, it's really not that abnormal. It's much more normal than people thought, right? So it was then unclassified. It no longer was considered abnormal. It was no longer considered a mental disorder. This happened back in like the early 60s or 70s. So there is a notion of normality, and that in and of itself is kind of a slippery slope because, again, what's in America, we're all races, all cultures, all ethnicities. We have so much influence from all these different places all the time. It's kind of hard to put your finger on what is normal, right? So I'll give you an example. I was at the gym a couple days ago, and there's this guy, and I cannot stand this guy. I just absolutely, I want to punch him in the face. And I know that's violent, but that's how badly it bothers me. And here's why. And it's the dumbest thing ever. And I'll admit that. So he walks in, right, and we all have masks on. You have to wear masks, so I can't see his face, but I can tell he's pretty young. And he's got headphones on, and the tight t-shirt, and he looks a little gym ratty, kind of thing. And he's not, huge swole dude, but he's got a good build and everything. So he walks around, and in between sets, he does this. He's like, and just like the world can't see him. And I literally just stare at him because I want so badly for him to go, what? So that I can say, do you realize that people can see you acting like that? And I don't know what his reaction to that will be, but I'm a little bit confrontational like that because there's like 80, 90, maybe 100 people in the gym at any given moment. And look around. Nobody else is doing that. So it makes me wonder, like, what is going on up here? What is the mental process driving that behavior? And we come up with a proposal of reasons, right? For instance, maybe he's extraordinarily insecure and he badly needs attention. And so he's going to do whatever he can do to bring all that attention to him, even negative attention, right? And we see that in like elementary schools, little kids that'll, pretend to fall out of their chair on accident, knowing that kids are going to laugh at them and they get in trouble, but at least they get a little bit of attention, right? So it's not unprecedented to think that somebody would kind of do this weird abnormal thing just to get a little bit of attention, to feel a little bit of something from another human being, right? Maybe it's the other end of the spectrum. Maybe this guy is so supremely confident that he doesn't give a crap what anybody thinks. And he's going to get down and he's going to fire himself up and he's going to get that adrenaline going so he gets that pump on. I don't know. So maybe he's insecure. Maybe he's narcissistic. Could be any of those, right? Maybe he thinks that is going to land him the hottest girl in the gym. Maybe girls are into that. Maybe I've been doing it wrong this whole time. I don't know. So that is one of the goals of psychology, is we want to explain those kind of behaviors, those kind of mental processes. So we want to do it in a frame of reference of normalcy. What is normal? I think that's not normal. What about people that walk around and they talk like this on their cell phone, on speaker, and as they're walking, blah, 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 blah? Is this really that much more difficult than talking like this? Like, I don't want to hear that conversation, and I don't need to hear you yelling. Is this any more inconvenient? Right? So I want answers to things like that. I seek to understand what makes people do the dumb crap I see people do. So that's explained. Predict. Predict is maybe my favorite one on the list, to be honest, because when you get it right, you feel like a magician, right? You know somebody backwards and forward, and then you put them in a situation and you predict how they're going to handle it. And if you know them right and you do the right research and you understand basic tenets of psychology, sometimes you can predict exactly how it'll go. And then you're like, yes, called it, right? And then other times you're surprised. They do something completely different and you're like, oh, well, I'm pleasantly surprised. Sometimes it's good to be wrong, right? So I really like the predict notion here. The problem with the prediction, so one of the jobs that I had when I was in college is I was a prison guard. I worked at the Huntsville unit where they do the executions in Huntsville, and they also release every Texas inmate that gets paroled out of the Walls unit, the Huntsville unit. And so I knew a lot of parole officers at the time. And one of the things I would talk to them about, such and such was telling me he got denied for parole, and what's the deal? And they said, well, I heard this line time and time and time and time again. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And that's really kind of deep if you think about it. It's deeper than it probably sounds initially. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Why is that? Well, because when we're talking about adults now we're not talking about past behavior from children to future behavior of adults, right? That doesn't always translate because we have a lot of developmental changes that occur. But when we're talking about adult past behavior and adult future behavior, once you get to like a certain age, and we'll talk about this in personality chapter, but you don't change all that much. And I know people want to argue that, you mature, sure you do. But the foundational component, the core of who you are as a person, are you trustworthy? Are you reliable? Are you extroverted or introverted? Are you conscientious? These basic traits that you have in your personality, they don't change that much. So, if it's something that you did as an adult, you'll probably do it again. That's why they say cheaters, once a cheater, always a cheater. Most of the time, that's true. Now, again, the thing about prediction that you have to be careful of is the exigent circumstances. So let's use that example, right? Cheating, cheaters and cheaters, right? So, do you think there's a difference between somebody that cheats? Are all cheaters the same? Do you think it's possible that some cheaters are in a perfectly fine relationship with somebody that they actually have very strong feelings for and that are reciprocated and everything is perfect, but there's just some insecurity going on with them emotionally, mentally, that makes them sort of always strive to get approval and attention and affection from other people. They're getting it here at home, but then they go to work and they need it there too. And so they're flirting, and they talk to everybody that'll talk to them, and they put feelers out just to see, because if I flirt with that girl and she flirts back, and then I take it a step further and I'm like, hey, you want to hook up? And she's like, yeah. I'm now getting this affirmation that I'm a worthy enough person that this person wants me, and I badly need that. I'm getting it here, but I need it here too. Now, there's cheaters that do that, right? Do they change? I don't think so. Not unless some dramatic things happen, and there is a dramatic change in personality, which is a very small percentage of time that happens. So yes, I think that term is applicable. Now, what about somebody that is in a relationship and they don't have a healthy sex life? Let's say that they're constantly asking, constantly begging, constantly wanting more of or different or whatever it is that they're not getting, and they're communicative about it, and the person is just like, no, I don't care. No, I'm not going to do that. All right, yeah. Oh, well, have a headache. And then after just time and time and time, they don't want to up stakes and just leave, because there's a love there. There's that, but there's just this big piece missing, right? They don't want to. It's not worth leaving, but it's also miserable to stay. And then an opportunity presents itself, and it's been a while, and they have a moment of weakness and a moment of temptation, and stars align just right, and bad decisions are made. Is that person always going to cheat? And let's say they get caught and they get divorced and they lose their kids, and then years later they get into another relationship, and then they find themselves in a similar circumstance. Would you say, yep, they did it before, they'll do it again? I would argue not necessarily. That person very likely could have learned a lesson from the first time and not do it the second time, because their behavior was emotionally driven, it was cognitively driven, but it was maybe I can do this and get away with it, and you rationalize it. Well, I deserve it because I've been communicative, and they just say, well, tough, oh well. So the second time you're faced, maybe in a similar circumstance, maybe you're more mature now, and you're more able to, instead of rationalizing, going, you know what, that never works out well. So no, I'm not going to do that. My options are live with what I've got, or leave, and then I can pursue other things. But I'm not going to try to have my cake and eat it too. So when we're talking about predicting behavior, it's very interesting, because it's sometimes possible to know these exigent circumstances, and sometimes it's impossible to know. And sometimes things change that are relevant, like the world, right? The world is a much different place than it was 10 years ago. When I was a cop, people didn't love cops, right? But I was a white cop that worked the projects, and it wasn't that bad. I mean, I didn't go around beating people up and shooting people and stuff, so I guess I wasn't one of the bad ones. But, I wasn't, people weren't throwing stuff at me. People weren't calling me names. They also weren't stopping. I had to chase everybody. But, that's to be expected. That's part of the job. But now, even black cops that work the projects, which is predominantly African American, they're getting things thrown at them. They're getting called names. They're getting assaulted. They're getting ambushed, and it's based on it's still based on race. Well, you betrayed your race to wear a badge, and Uncle Tom, and they hear all these names and all these things, these horrible things that people say, and it's just like, holy crap, man! I'm so glad I'm not in that profession anymore. So times change. So if we want to predict like how a certain policing strategy will be received by the public, and so we go, well, we did this back in 2001 and it was very well received. Well, okay, but this is not 2001, so we can't do that now. I mean, times are different. So the biggest component to predicting is being able to sort that out. You need all the intelligence that you can get. You need to understand literally just every different aspect of whatever the decision is. That person and their individual, their environment, both immediate around them and the external environment that's a little larger, the macro environment, if you will. So prediction is a really, really neat, I think, thing, because it's like this giant puzzle and you never know if you have all the pieces, and you're still trying to put together a picture, but you don't even know what the picture is going to be. It really requires a lot of brain power. So the prediction component is definitely my forte on this list. All right, and then finally the last one is to influence. We want to use the results of research to solve practical problems that involve behaviors and mental processes. One of the things that I'll talk about in a few minutes is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's a triangle, and on the bottom, the first rung, the first need to be met, according to Maslow, is physiological needs. So you need to have food, you need to have water, be hydrated, you need to be healthy before you can move on to the next step, which is then safety. We want to feel safe in our environment, and then the next thing after that is love and belonging. We want we want to feel loved by like our parents and our family and our friends. We want to feel a sense of belonging. And if you have that, then you move on to the next step, and you go all the way to the top, which is self-actualization. And that's whenever we're a very well-adjusted adult. Well, one of the things that was brought up using that theory was that students, especially the young ones, are coming to school hungry. They don't eat breakfast because they don't have food at their house. And so when they get to school, they're starving. They don't have their very first need met. Their physiological needs are not being met. And how can they possibly sit in a classroom and learn if they're hungry and they're thirsty? And then towards the end of the day, they got to go back home. And they're worried about that because they don't have food, they don't have safety, they don't have love and belonging, they don't have anything on that list. And we're trying to teach these kids, and they're not emotionally well adjusted. So we can't fix everything as a school environment, but we can maybe knock out that physiological need. Let's offer breakfast. So they started offering breakfast in the morning as a pilot program to see if it improved grades, and they went through the roof. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs and that theory that he proposed influenced public policy, and they allocated funds to feeding children, which that's a great thing to begin with, but the other side of that is that their grades started improving. They started feeling a sense of belonging, because when you do well in school, you feel like you're supposed to be there, right? You have a sense of belongingness. So we're trucking up that ladder just by giving them a biscuit in the morning, right? And now all of a sudden they have their physiological needs met, their safety needs, a little bit, right? At least while they're at school, that's met. And then their love and belongingness, at least while they're at school, is met. And suddenly people were doing better in school. And the dropout rate over a longitudinal study, the dropout rate actually improved. So this really influenced the educational environment, all because one man had a theory that is a very well-known theory. So, of course, that is the last goal. So we want to describe behavior, explain behavior, predict behavior, and ultimately influence behavior. All right, moving on. Let's go through the history real quick. Now, here's my philosophy on teaching an intro class, right? What is an introduction? Introduction to psychology. That's the name of this class, right? So what is an introduction? Well, if I came in and I said, I'm Dr. Hageman, that's an introduction, right? Do you know anything about me at all? No. So, to me, this is my opinion, an introduction is nothing more than exposure. I'm going to expose you to the history of psychology. I'm going to expose you to biopsychology. I'm going to expose you to research methods. I'm going to expose you to all these different topics, right? All the chapters that we're going to go through. Am I going to go into deep, dark corners of each one of them? No. Frankly, we don't have time, and this is a weird format I'm still sort of getting adjusted to. And yeah, it's just too much. Now, if you're going to go on and major in psychology, the good news is you have to take history of psychology as an entire course in and of itself. You have to take biopsychology. You have to take sensation and perception. Those are individual standalone classes. And then guess what? If you want to be a grad student, you're going to take them again in grad school. You're going to write papers about them. So by the time you get a PhD, you know quite a bit about all these different things. But for most of you, you're not going to major in psychology. So you're taking this as a prereq or a required class. You need to be exposed to these concepts so that you know, like, oh yeah, I heard of that. Oh really, what does that mean? Oh, yeah, I don't really remember that. Perfectly acceptable. So I'm going to go through the history of psychology in just a couple of slides, and really it's like one slide per major movement. Again, this is a whole semester-long course whittled down to 5 slides. So when you watch the videos, the crash course videos, by the way, awesome. I love that guy. He's one of the only people I know that talks faster than I do, but you can always rewind, right? I think he's entertaining, so it's not a big pain in the butt to watch it twice if you have to. And I think he does a really good job of explaining things in a very short, I mean, they're 10 minutes, so arguably it's not super short, but to explain some of the concepts that he does in less than 10 minutes is, I think, pretty impressive. So I've included a couple of them. Now, I know there's 4 chapters, and I only included 3 of them. That's because the chapter that's on research, I think I'll cover that well enough. I've taught that class for a number of years. It's kind of a specialty, and I think I can cover it without any additional assistance from anybody. And it's not really something that needs graphics and pictures and stuff that he offers. So I didn't include one for that. There is one. If you want to watch it, you're welcome to. But yeah, I just included the 3 for the other chapters. So his chapter on history is going to probably be a little deeper than mine. And as far as testing purposes, I would say I haven't made the test yet, but I'm going to shoot for roughly 85% of the exam to be straight off the PowerPoints. And the other 15% will come from the videos. But out of that 15%, they're going to be major points. All right. So if he throws a date in there or mentions some person's name in like a single sentence and you don't see it in the PowerPoints, you're probably not going to see that again on the tests. I don't want you to have to watch these videos and take copious notes and stop and write and push play and then stop again and write and play. That's not what I want. I want you to just click on it, sit back, pay attention to it. Don't be on your phone or anything for 10 minutes. Watch the video. Maybe he'll clarify a few points that I'm gleaning through, right? All right, so moving on. Quick history, psychology family tree. This is Wilhelm Wundt. Wilhelm Wundt is the father of psychology. By the way, you don't need to know dates. I'm not going to ask you birth dates or when they died or anything. That's just for frame of reference, so you get an idea of like what era we were talking about, right? All right, so Wilhelm Wundt started the first psychological laboratory at the University of Leipzig in Germany back in 1879. You might see that date, but here's a fun fact about that date. And actually, all the textbooks say 1879. When I taught history of psychology, I had to do a little research, right? You always want to go beyond what your book says. And what I discovered was it actually didn't start in 1879. It started in 1878. Well, how does every textbook have it wrong? Well, because, this is just splitting hairs, I know, but in 1878, University of Leipzig cordoned off that area. They refurbished it or whatever for his purposes, and they awarded it to him in 1878, and he began using it midway through 1878. And there are students that talked about doing experiments in 1878, but they weren't published until 1879. So whenever you're looking for like, well, when's the first so really that should say the first publications that came from a psychology laboratory were published in 1879. But actually the lab started the year before that. So it actually started in 1878. But anyways, it's interesting how I have seen that 1879 date in probably at least 5 different grad school classes, in intro and history, both in undergraduate and grad school. Everybody said 1879 until I did my own research and found out, nope, it was actually 1878 that it started. It just, history gets it wrong a lot. So anyway, fun fact. All right, so what did that lab even look like, right? So Wilhelm Wundt decided that he wanted to study kind of what was going on in people's conscious minds, right? So one of the first experiments they did was they had people sit in a chair, right? And they didn't tell them what was going to happen. They just sat here. And then the researcher, Dr. Wundt, would stand behind them and then suddenly would clap his hands. And the person would undoubtedly jump, and then Wundt would jump around and he would say, "How do you feel right now?" In a much better German accent than that was. And the person would say, startled? No, no, go deeper. How did you feel before we got started? How did you feel when the sound happened? How did you feel after the sound happened? And so they would describe it, and they would say, well, I guess I felt a little anxious. I didn't know what to expect, and you were back there, and it made me a little uncomfortable that I couldn't see you, and I don't know you, and you're behind me. That was kind of strange. And the next thing I know, the sound happened, and that startled me, and I felt scared, like, oh my gosh, what happened? Did something fall? Did somebody get hurt? Like what? And then I thought, you stepped around, and I thought, oh, maybe this is part of the thing. So my anxiety came back down, and now I feel a little better, and now I'm feeling kind of excited because, I see that you're conducting an experiment. I don't really understand it, but I'm eager to be part of it. So that's kind of the emotional roller coaster that I just went through. And he's, writing all this down. Right? So this method is known as introspection, right? Intro meaning inside, inspection meaning observe. So you're observing what's going on inside. Any problems with that? Well, have you ever met somebody that just doesn't seem to be capable of introspection? It reminds me of Walking Dead, back when the show was really good. Actually, it's good now. It started off amazing, then it got kind of crappy, and now it's kind of getting better again. But back whenever it was in like the prison setting, I think it was season 3 or whatever, one of my favorite lines from the movie. So if you haven't seen the movie, understand there's a zombie apocalypse, right? This band of people like sticking together, and they're caravanning through looking for like safety, right? There is no safety, and they find it's a prison, and it's, for the most part, let's say it's abandoned, right? Well, there's walls and there's chain fences and there's big concrete and bars and all that, so it's safe. So they can go into these runs that have beds in them, close the door, and actually sleep on a bed and not worried about getting their face bit off in the middle of the night, right? It's kind of an important find if you can put yourself in that, theoretical world. So they find it, and they're all excited and everything, and there's this one guy that's with them, Merle, and he's like this country bumpkin, like delinquent kind of guy or whatever, and nobody likes him. He's kind of a criminal, but he's part of the group, and he's kind of left to himself. And at one point, Rick Grimes, who's kind of the leader, he goes and he sees all the doors are open, and he looks, and all the beds are just shredded, cut open, all the stuffing pulled out. Who would sabotage the first bed that these people have seen in years, right? So he gets to the end of the run, and there's Merle cutting them up with his knife or anything, and he was like, "What are you doing?" And Merle goes, "Best drugs I ever found was stashed inside a prison mattress. Just trying to see what I could find." What are the off chances, right, that he's going to dig through even 100 mattresses and find drugs, right? Very slim possibility. But my favorite was the reaction, right? Grimes looks at him and he just goes, you think he's going to get mad, he's going to scream and yell, or he's going to go hit him, or he's going to kick him out of the group or something, right? He just goes, "Do you even know why you do the things you do?" It was just such a great moment because it's like, ooh, that was almost like the best burn I could think of because it's just cuts to the core and it's true, right? And we've all known people like that, people that do stuff and they just don't even know why they're doing it, right? But it's pretty clear to somebody else, like, oh, I know why he's doing that. So introspection wasn't highly regarded in the scientific community, right? Now this is this new field, right? Psychology, born from philosophy, trying to distinguish itself as a hard science by these like meticulous observations and everything. But really, what are we observing? We're observing things that are not really measurable and they're subjective at best. And some people can't do it. Some people do it really well. Some people do it okay. So it was gaining some attention, and it certainly turned out, some people that went on to further the field. So it definitely started something, but it wasn't an instant success. It wasn't an instant, oh my gosh, this is the new science, right? It was an uphill battle, to say the least. Well, one of his top students was a man by the name of Edward Titchener, and Titchener was excited. He went through the studies, he finished his degree, and he said, I'm going to take this to America. I think this would be a big hit in America, probably bigger than it is here, right? So he goes to Cornell University, and he did a little rebranding. He changed a few things. He wanted to make it his own, and there were things that he frankly just didn't agree with. So he sort of eased up some of the observational requirements to some extent. Once observational requirements were extremely stringent, and Titchener said, "Nah, it takes too long. Let's shorten that up a little bit. The training that's involved, let's cut that down by like 90%. I could show somebody how to do introspection, observation much faster than what you say. And let's call it something different. Let's call it not functionalism. Let's call it structuralism." So he changed the name to structuralism. Well, Wilhelm Wundt back in Germany was like, I'm washing my hands of that dude. I don't claim what he does is not what I do. Okay, this is psychology. What he's doing is garbage, basically. So they did not see eye to eye. They did not. Wundt never really got on board with structuralism. Did not agree with Titchener's ideologies, basically. So now we have functionalism going on in Germany. We have structuralism going on starting in America, and they're both kind of coming back and forth. You got some people that come from America back to Germany, and now they do structuralism next door to other people doing functionalism. But by and large, without that getting all confusing, they were sort of two peas in the same pod, basically doing the same thing. So functionalism. The face of functionalism became a man by the name of William James. Now, he is sort of the American father of psychology. So he was more concerned with how mental processes are used, adapting to their environment. Charles Darwin, everybody knows the name Darwin, famous for his evolutionary theory. Parts of the evolutionary theory were sort of incorporated into the psychology theories that were out of the day. But really, the biggest influence of Darwinism was the observational techniques. Darwin was meticulous with recording every little nuanced thing, color, size, shape, who, what, when, where, all of that stuff, right? Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant scientist when it came to the details. And so those details were picked up by William James and other people. And they said, hey, you know what? We need to observe things, and we can't observe structuralism, mental process. We can't observe them. So we need to add behavior. We can observe behavior, and we can put all that together. So now there is another movement called behaviorism, which we're not to yet, but you can see that's sort of laying the groundwork for that, right? So that's functionalism. So now we're at behaviorism. So behaviorism, the faces of behaviorism are John Watson and B.F. Skinner. Now we're going to talk about both of them later when we talk about the chapter on learning. So you don't need to know their theories necessarily right now because we'll cover that later, but know the names that are associated with the movements. So structuralism is Titchener. Functionalism is, I guess we'll call Wundt and William James both functionalists. And then behaviorism, know the names Watson and Skinner. Again, you don't need to know the details of their theories necessarily. Just know that their names are associated with the movements. Okay. All right. So John Watson looked at both sides, structuralism and functionalism. They're both going on, kind of arguing amongst themselves. And then he was like, "No. Look, we can't talk about cognitive processes. The only thing we should be talking about is behavior." Because it is the only thing we can observe, and if we're going to be a science, we have to be able to observe it. If we can't observe it, we can't study it, right? I mean, look at religion, right? Religion is not considered a science. It's more of a philosophy. It's kind of its own thing, right? Why? Because we can't study it. We can study it. We can't measure it. We can't observe it, right? We have to go on faith. Everything's based on faith. Well, we don't want this science to be based on like a faith, right? So that's not going to work for me. So he focused on nothing but behavior, and it took off. So, and another part of that is there was an application to what he was doing, right? We weren't seeing as much applied psychology come out of the functionalism, structuralism approaches. When behaviorism started, hey, if we do this, we will shape this behavior. Hey, you know what? If we want this behavior to occur, we need to give positive reinforcement. And if we want to stop this behavior, we need to give negative reinforcement. These are all things that we'll talk about later. But when these were applied, results happened. And it was, you could see it. You could predict it, you could explain it, you could influence behaviors with these kind of theories that were applied. So it just worked. And behaviorism became the psychology. Basically, at this point, functionalism and structuralism died out. They were fairly short-lived, right? They kind of got the ball rolling, and then when behaviorism came, it knocked it out of the park, and the other two kind of essentially went bankrupt. So behaviorism is the new psychology. All right, that brings us to my personal favorite. I absolutely love Sigmund Freud. Now, I don't love him because he was right about everything. I love him because he came to a field that was complex and arguing, and he made it make sense. Now, his theories, some of them are out there. Some of them I think are way out of left field and not at all right. But there's still something remarkable about coming to something that is chaos and giving it order. And I can respect that. Even if it's wrong, you're right? I understand that. I concede that he's wrong about some things. But, I mean, he got a lot of things right, I think, as well. He was a huge turnoff to some because he had a very large... a lot of his theories were based on, or at least tied to, sex. Sex drive and libido were huge to him. And you have to understand the times. I mean, husband and wife a lot of times slept in separate beds back then, even husbands and wives. So sleeping in the same bed was a little bit like, oh, yeah, don't talk about that, right? And you didn't ever want somebody to see the bed because that was almost dirty. People see the bed and they're like, a man and woman both sleep in that together, right? It was a big deal. And here's this man talking about, and we'll talk about him later. Again, one of my very favorites. But I mean, he's sitting here offering theories saying that all little children want to have sex with their mothers. I mean, not well received, right? People can't even talk about it. People can't debate his theories because it was just like, oh my gosh, that's so left field. So people didn't get on board with the emphasis that he placed on sex. But, I mean, really? Look at the world now. Okay, now we can talk about it a little bit. I don't know, a couple of examples. Bill Clinton, tarnished his entire presidency so he could perform a sex act with at the time anyway, not even very attractive intern. How many people have lost multi-billion-dollar marriages or legacies of their sports legacies or film legacies or whatever, businessmen, prominent businessmen or whatever, have risked it all for a single night with a woman? I mean, how many times has it happened? I mean, you can't even count, right? So tell me again that sex drive is not causing behaviors. Tell me again that it's not a major influence whenever it can make somebody, literally ruin their entire life and know ahead of time that that's the risk. I'm going to do this affair, but if I get caught, I'm going to lose everything. I'm going to lose my house. I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose my kids. I'm going to lose my wife. I'm going to lose all my friends. I'm going to have to start life over again at 45 years old or however old you are whenever you do it. And people do it anyway, right? So there's my argument is that, look, people didn't like him because he emphasized sex too much. If anything, I think he hit it right on the nose. I think it is absolutely that big of a deal. And people he was ahead of his time. You just couldn't talk about it back then. But because he was discounted way back when, nobody has really revisited some of those older theories that were based on that now and talk about it. I think you could probably dig up his old books and apply what he taught back then to a world that's a little more receptive to dealing with issues regarding sex, and you'd find, oh, wow, yeah. I mean, look at, I probably should have led with this, but look at Weinstein, right? Harvey Weinstein. Look at his life now. Look at Bill Cosby in prison now because he was drugging women and having sex with them, even though they probably would have just done it while they were awake. I mean, he was, not a bad-looking guy. He was rich and famous and loved, and I'm sure he could have had pretty much any woman he wanted. Look at Epstein, multi-billionaire, and he's paying his assistant to bring underage women to give him massages, right? I mean, the list goes on and on. So anyways, we're going to talk about him. Excited to do that and see what y'all think about Freud. But he based a lot of his theories on the unconscious drives that we have. And that was very different because, again, remember, we started with functionalism and behaviorism, right? And we're looking at mental processes. But then that kind of went away because behaviorism said, we can't study those things. If you can't observe them, you can't study them. And everybody agreed, and behaviorism became the thing. And now Freud comes along, and he goes, but we're being driven really mostly by unconscious desires. So imagine the researchers in the field at the time. They're like, wait. You want us to study? We're going to take a step backwards now and go back to things that we can't see. And not only can we not see them, but they're unconscious. We're not even aware of them. So how can we study that, you idiot? Another thing that I like about Freud is that he was able to get people on board with that, even through that uphill battle. It's like, we've already learned this lesson. We can't observe it. We can't study it. We don't want to touch it. And he said, no, but it's that important. And here's how we observe it. I cannot be aware of my unconscious forces because they're unconscious. But you can see me acting a certain way, and you can dig those from the unconscious up to the conscious so that I may then evaluate them and go, yeah, that probably is why I was doing that. For instance, again, as a law enforcement officer, I saw cops that absolutely, without question, were bullied and picked on whenever they were young. And that's what made them become cops. And guess what they did? They became bullies. It's like their entire life they were bullied, and so now they're going to get even, and they're going to go out there and they're going to bully the crap out of everybody, right? Because they have a badge to hide behind. I hate those guys. So now I also saw the other side of that. I saw people who were bullied. Believe it or not, in junior high school, I was badly bullied. There were 3 guys that beat me up almost every day in PE. And I was the other side of the coin. I went into law enforcement because I wanted to find people that were like that were bullies, and I wanted to lock them up because I know what that's like. I know what it's like to be on that side of bullying, and I wouldn't wish it upon my worst enemy. And so I didn't become that. I sought to fight against it. So our unconscious, I was very consciously aware, and I think part of the reason that happened was because I worked at that prison in between. And I was going to college for psychology, so I was getting a little insight from my education. I was working as a prison guard, and that will challenge you. I mean, I'm, 20, I was 22, 23 years old, and I'm barking orders to somebody that's 50, and a different generation. They're not, they're used to, respecting your elders kind of thing, even though he's an inmate and I'm a guard. I mean, you have to do what I say, even though I'm half your age, right? So it was a very interesting dynamic, and I found very quickly that what got me through to them the best was to offer respect. I didn't call anybody inmate, even though most of my coworkers said, "Hey, inmate, come here." I would say, "Hey, Mr. Johnson, can I see you for a second?" And it was unbelievable the responses that I got from those inmates. They were like, "Me? Like, you call me Mr. So-and-so?" Or I'd say, "Sir," if I didn't know their name. "Excuse me, sir." And they wouldn't even look because they know I'm not talking to them, right? Who talks to inmates like that? "Excuse me, sir." And they would turn around and was like, "Yeah, you." And they come over. Now, you got to do it just right, because if you do it a certain way, you come off as weak, right? You have to do it in a way that I'm not weak. I'm just giving you respect. And man, I could have any inmate in that unit do anything I wanted, anytime I wanted, because I was one of the few people that kind of figured that lesson out. and gave them that. So, I was very aware of kind of my past and the danger that I saw that could bring turning me into a bully versus I guess going the different route that I went. Um, I just saw it so many times with coworkers and the way that they would interact with people, and I'd always shake my head and go, yeah, they don't even know. They don't even know why they're doing what they're doing. Um, so Freud really put all that on the map. He really brought the unconscious to the forefront of academia and studying. He did some other stuff, and again, we'll go into him in a lot more detail later. All right, here's the thing that I alluded to earlier with Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow being the names I want you to associate with humanistic psychology. Humanistic psychology, very quickly, I already kind of went over the self-actualization pyramid, very famous for Maslow. The thing that really differentiated this one is the behaviors. They rejected the behaviors view that behavior is determined by their environment. That's what behaviors were preaching. Your environment controls your behavior, right? And humanistic psychologists did not agree with that. And there's a lot of complicated reasons why it does, but yet sometimes it doesn't, which is probably beyond the scope of this course. So just say for now, they rejected that view, and then they also rejected the psychoanalytic view that behavior is determined by unconscious forces. They didn't believe that either. So they thought everybody is unique and different. And it's odd because they basically said that psychology can't exist to say this thing caused this person to do this thing and expand that to anybody but this one person. Because everybody is so unique. We have so many traits, so many personality characteristics that you can put me in any situation, and given my 50 different traits and 50 different pieces of circumstantial, whatever's going on with this situation, that's what's going to happen. Essentially, they said you can never predict what anybody's ever going to do ever, right? Because there's just too much difference from person to person. But I think really why they became popular, in my opinion, I think why this really took off was because it was very positive. You go to Freud and you tell him, yeah, I'm struggling with this, and he's going to dig through your childhood and he's going to look for anything that would make you maladaptive. He's going to look through any kind of trauma, any kind of negative influence or issues that you're carrying through from your past, right? So it's focused on the negative. Let's fix what's wrong with you, and by doing so, we're going to focus on what's wrong with you. Behaviorism is sort of the same way. We're looking at behaviors and we're trying to, reward positive behaviors and punish bad behaviors, and there's a lot of focus on that. In humanistic psychology, they look at people's strengths. They look at people's growth and the choices that they make and their psychological health. And it was kind of in the hippie era. It was like the early 70s. And people were talking about peace and love and all these happy, positive things. And then humanistic psychology just fit perfectly well into sort of the culture that was going on at the time. So you have behaviorism that's happening. Then you have Freud, psychoanalysts that are going on, and they're very, very different, right? So you're subscribing to one school or the other, and now the humanistic psychology comes along, and they're, again, different than both of the first two. So now we have kind of three major forces fighting in the field of psychology. All right, so we'll kind of end that with the different perspective talks. We'll kind of mention some other perspectives as we go through the class a little bit more, but that's sort of the historical foundation. Those three big fields, behaviorism, which got its roots from functionalism and structuralism, and then from behaviorism to psychoanalyst, and then from psychoanalyst to humanist. Those three sort of make up psychology for years and years and years to come, right? None of them really have completely gone away. I would say psychoanalysts have pretty much gone away for the most part, but not all of his underlying theories. But as a modality of therapy, it's not very well utilized, but mostly that's because insurance wants you to get in, get fixed, and then they want to stop paying. and psychoanalysis takes years, and they don't want to pay for that. So really, it's become more of a financially driven necessity that psychoanalysts don't do it the way that they used to do with the whole couch and tell me about your childhood and all that kind of stuff, because you're going to be going for months and months and months talking about nothing but childhood stuff. You're not even getting to the issue yet. And again, insurance companies are not going to pay $85 a visit for that. So they want you to get in, focus on the point, focus on the problem, get some therapeutic help. How can I fix this problem? We'll pay for 3 visits. So it's not that it doesn't work. It's that people just don't want to pay for it. So it exists. It's not as popular as it used to be. All right, so let's talk about specialties in psychology and wrap up this chapter. So clinical psychology. Now I want to kind of go out of order here, and I want to talk about clinical, and then I want to talk about counseling back to back. I probably should change the order on here. Here's the thing. A clinical psychologist and a counseling psychologist are exactly the same thing. All right? There is a slight difference in the way they see themselves and the way they approach their practice. All right? A clinical psychologist focuses on the diagnosis of a mental disorder. Like, that is what their real focus is. I want to figure out what's wrong with you, number one. The next thing I want to do is I want to design a treatment plan. This is what we need to do to fix that disorder if it's fixable, right? Now, if you have something like schizophrenia, your treatment is medication. But other things are very treatable, right? So if it's a depression type issue or whatever, that can be treated with different kinds of therapy, talk therapy. So we're going to design that. We're going to give you some goals. And then sometimes I'm going to kick you out. I'm done with you. You're going to go to a lower level, like master's level counselor, and they will walk through this treatment plan with you, right? But my focus is on the clinical diagnosis. Now, a counseling psychologist, guess what they do? Exactly the same thing. They diagnose you, they design a treatment plan, but more often than not, they are going to follow through that treatment plan. They're going to do the talk therapy with you. They're going to figure out a weekly schedule, and they're going to meet with you every week, and they're going to do all that. Not that clinicals don't do that. They do. But the clinical focus is clinical, and the counseling focus is counseling, hence the 2 different names. But they do the same thing. It's the same degree. It's the same license that's given by the same licensing board. It's the same requirements for both. So they're the same. So there was a big push, maybe 10, 12 years ago to do away with that, to kind of get rid of some of the confusion for people that are looking for practices because they don't really know the difference. And so they said, well, let's just do away with the 2 different titles. And there was tons of pushback from both communities because the clinical people really like that clinical name, right? That sounds doctorly, like I should have a lab coat and a stethoscope and work in a hospital, and I'm seen on the same level as a medical doctor. I don't want to lose that, right? Counselor, you can get a master's degree and be called a counselor. I don't want people to confuse me with that low-level LPC master's level counselor, right? So the clinicians kind of won that. And then the counseling therapist said, well, the reason that we exist is to help our patients or help our clients. So, the focus should really not be on us and the narcissistic view of ourselves, but on helping the client. So counseling is what people are looking for. They're not looking for diagnosis. They're like, hey, there's something wrong with me and I want to get better. So they're looking for counselors. They're not looking for clinicians. And they have a good argument too. So eventually they just said, okay, it's a moot point and it's a tie, and we're going to let you both keep it. So clinical and counseling, almost identical. Now there are 2 other ones that sound the same, but they're not. And that is school psychologist and educational psychologist, which is down here. School psychologists, think of it this way. Their focus is on getting all kids to the same level. So you're going to have some kids in a school setting that have developmental disorders. Okay, they're behind. You're going to have some kids that have behavioral disorders, which again will cause them to get behind. So they might have learning disorders. Again, they're going to get behind. So a school psychologist will diagnose these issues, and they will say, this kid has got whatever, right? Whatever the developmental issue is. Maybe it's autism. Maybe it's some sort of dyslexia. Maybe it is, what would be another one? Autism, dyslexia. Those are two really big ones. Then there's certain behavioral issues that could be a problem for obviously for a learning environment. So they come in and they diagnose those things, and they design what they call a 504 special ed for that kid, and they get certain accommodations. Maybe, and I have people in my classes even at this level that are say in the same boat, right? They have certain accommodations. They're allowed to have a note taker assist them with taking notes. They're allowed to have extra time on a test because their reading comprehension maybe is below standard, or maybe they have dyslexia and it takes them longer to decipher the words. All kinds of different accommodations, extra time, everything should be presented verbally because they have issues with reading or whatever. So that is a school psychologist function, is to get everybody on the same playing field, right? Now the educational psychologist, it's a different job. They study how people learn, and they look at like classroom environments. How many people can we put in a classroom? If we put 2 or 3, you get one-on-one attention, right? If we put 123, well, you get, nobody. And so what is the optimal class size for learning? Are students better visually? Are they better tactile? Are they better with auditory learning? Clearly we're going to have some people that are better in different modalities, so how do we incorporate teaching for a classroom full of people that learn differently? Well, we have to do a little bit of all of that, which is why you can see me and you can read what I'm saying, because this appeals to some and this appeals to others. So that is what an educational psychologist looks at. So they both work in a school setting, but one is focused on treating kids that have a disorder, and the other one is how can we best optimize learning. So those are the difference between those two. All right, forensic psychology. Forensic psychology is, again, kind of near and dear to me. I worked for a brief while in this field. You can do a lot of different things in the forensic setting. So forensic is Latin for in the forum of, and in this case, law. So it translates to in the forum of law. Forensic psychologists can be anything from every once in a while you'll have a police department that's large enough. My old police department had 3 actually police psychologists, and they're full-time employed by the department, and they're not contracted. They're actually employees of the department, and they do nothing but counseling police officers. They deal with police officers after if they have really poor performance on evaluations, and it's maybe due to home life is bad or whatever, then they can go in for mandatory counseling. So you're told to go. If you've ever been involved in a shooting, you have to get evaluated to return to duty. We all watch enough TV to know that that's the case. So you could work in that kind of thing. Everybody thinks, not everybody, but every semester there's somebody that's like, I'm going to be a forensic profiler. No, you're not. Here's why I say that. All right, Hollywood makes it look like every little Montgomery Police Department probably has a forensic profiler, right? The Harris County Sheriff Department, they're huge, right? They probably have 5 or 6. You know how many they have? None. It just doesn't exist. It's a Hollywood myth. Now, of course, the FBI does have something called the Behavioral Science Unit. When I was a student at Sam Houston in 2000, we actually had a guy named Bob Kessler that came to Sam Houston and gave a speech, and it was awesome because this is the man that literally coined the term serial killer. He invented that term, right? He invented criminal profiling, and he came to our college and he gave this little lecture. It was awesome, and he said, and now he was not a psychologist. He was an Army CID investigator, which is a criminal investigative division for the Army. He was basically a detective for the Army. And he got out of that and then got into the FBI. And whenever he got there, they put him in violent crimes. So he was looking into violent crimes, and he started just interviewing these people that had committed these violent crimes, and he started noticing certain patterns, certain way that people would stalk their victims, and certain way that people would kind of escalate from murder 1 to murder 5 kind of thing. And he started kind of just putting together like kind of your basic criminal profile, and it became kind of a thing. Well, after that, those got studied and obviously reevaluated, and people started going to school just to be that. And the FBI, I haven't looked at their numbers in a long time. They probably have maybe 10 to 15 total, if I had to guess, in their behavioral sciences unit. And they're all PhDs. They're all from really good colleges. They're not from, and no offense to Sam Houston, but they didn't come from Sam Houston. They come from like Johns Hopkins, Harvard, Stanford. I mean, they come from mostly Ivy Leagues. You don't get your PhD and walk into the FBI as doing that. You get your PhD and you spend years writing papers, publishing articles on the subject. Usually, you spend some time like the Bureau of Prisons or something as a forensic psychologist, where you're doing counseling to inmates and writing articles. And after you've built a pretty solid resume, you might have a chance. So, not to dash anybody's hopes, but the whole criminal profiling thing is a Hollywood pop culture thing, and it is entirely unrealistic to expect to go into that particular field of forensic psychology as a profiler. They're just not used very often, and the ones that are used, I mean, there's just a small handful of them. Most of the time, big departments like Houston will send a packet to Quantico, to that team, who will review all the information. They'll write up a profile. They'll send it back to Houston. They don't even send somebody out to like walk the crime scenes and all the stuff you see on TV. So, anyways, another thing forensic psychologists do a lot of is the civil side of things. Somebody suing for damages. I knew a lady that used to do sexual harassment suits for police departments. Women that are sexually harassed and then end up losing their job or having to quit or whatever, and then they turn around and sue for sexual harassment. Well, once you win that and you can prove that you were in fact sexually harassed, the next phase is damages. Well, how do you give damage to somebody like that? Well, I mean, it's kind of hard. You have to evaluate how much harm was done psychologically. So she kind of had a niche where she would come in, and I'll allude to this again in another chapter because it pertains to one of the tests that we're going to study, but she'll give them this test that all pre-hires take, and then she'd look at the discrepancy between this is where they were pre-hire and this is where they were when they got fired. So here's the amount of damage psychologically that was done, and then let's translate that to dollars. So that's kind of cool. They work on civil cases involving children, like in divorce, both people fighting for custody. I think mom makes a better parent for the kid. I think dad makes a better parent for the kid, better environment for the kid. So they'll kind of do that evaluation for the courts. So lots and lots of work. Of course, they do competency hearings. Are they competent to stand trial? Andrea Yates, the lady that drowned her kids in the bathtub and said demons told her to do it, she was evaluated by forensic psychologists to determine whether or not she was insane at the time of the murder, whether or not she was capable of standing her trial. And you have to be able to assist in your own defense. So it doesn't happen. That plead isn't used very often. It only wins about 1% of the time it's used. So, lawyers try to dissuade their clients from trying to go the not guilty by reason of insanity, or NGRI. The NGRI route is not very successful or pushed by lawyers. So the need to bring in somebody for a competency evaluation is not particularly high. But yeah, they do. And just for the record, you can get a PhD in just forensic psychology. I would strongly discourage anybody from pursuing that route. And the reason is you have to get licensed. If you're going to do a competency hearing or anything like that, you're going to be working one-on-one with people, and you have to have a license to do that. So if you're going to get licensed, you need to go through the clinical or the counseling program so that you get those practicum hours and those internship hours, and then you can get your license, and then you can go work as a forensic psychologist. But if you just do the forensic program, most of the time it's more research-based, it's less clinical-based. So, number one, you're going to have some trouble getting licensed. Number two, when you're on the stand, they're going to try to ruin your credibility with the jury. And when you're up there and you're saying I have a PhD in forensic psychology, they're going to say, "Are you licensed?" Well, yes, I went back and I got my license. I did 2 years of postdoctoral work and blah 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 blah. Okay, but then you have the other sides, defense or whatever side you're on, the opposite side. They're going to say, I'm a clinical psychologist and I work in the field of forensics. And it just sounds better to juries. They just like it better. So the coursework is not that different. For my clinical program, I actually took all of my electives, which you don't get very many, but I got a few. I took all of them as forensic electives. So I actually have the clinical psychology coursework, but all of my electives, and then actually I think I took 2 classes more than that even fit into my degree, were forensic classes because I had the law enforcement background, so it made sense. They were interesting to me, and I already knew that field, so they were fairly easy classes for me. But forensic psychology is a great field, and you can make a bunch of money. So that's a pretty lucrative field. On this whole list, that's probably in the top 2. If there was a top one, probably the top one is the industrial organizational psychologist. They basically do what forensics do, but they do it for businesses instead of courts. So forensic psychologists will work for companies and they will do all kinds of stuff, anything that has to do with business. Maybe a company's having morale issues. They'll come in and they'll see why and how they can fix that. Maybe a company is going to roll out major changes. People don't like that, especially people that have been there doing it the same way for years and years and years, and then you're going to tell them, oh, we're changing the whole process. It doesn't go over very well, and it typically hurts morale. You get a bunch of people that start calling in sick or they quit, so you have a high turnover. So companies don't want that. That costs companies money. So a lot of times they'll hire an IO psychologist to come in and help ease the transition. They work better. They figure out the proper communication level. You don't want to tell them every little move you're making, but you also don't want to keep them in the dark. So there's like a middle ground there. You want to find like what's perfect. So they work as kind of a middleman between those two. Developmental psychology looks at changes over the lifespan. So clearly a toddler doesn't think the same way as an adolescent, and an adolescent doesn't think the same way as a young adult and even a late adult. So there's very definitive changes, both physiologically and cognitively, that are made throughout these different periods of our life. And a lot of you, or many of you, maybe take lifespan as a class. It's kind of interesting. It's not my favorite class to teach. I just can't pepper in as much fun stuff. It's mostly like, this is when babies walk, and this is when kids learn to do math, and it's like milestones, and I just find it a little boring. But it's interesting. It's just not super fun to teach. All right, I talked about educational already. Research psychologists are all those psychologists that drive old beat-up Hondas and live in dilapidated apartments. They don't make any money. The only people that make money in research psychology is people that are from like Harvard, Stanford, your Ivy Leagues kind of thing, and they're on cutting edge theories. They get grant money that's plenty enough to live on, plus those institutions, because you're bringing prestige to their university, they get nice salaries. But your typical research psychologists, they're not rolling in dough. So not a lot of money to be made there. Very important, not taking anything away from it, just not something I'm particularly interested in. Even though I taught research methods, it's one of those things where I can teach it, but I don't want to do it. Biopsychology is the study of biologically based answers. So this kind of tries to bring psychology as close as possible to neuroscience and like the medical field, right? They look at the parts of the brain, they look at the neurotransmitters and different chemical reactions that occur in our brain, and they try to make sense of how that correlates with behavior and thoughts and mental processes and emotional management, all these kind of things, but from a strictly biological standpoint. So that's biopsychology. It's definitely an interesting field. I don't know a whole lot about employment and how easy it is to get, but it's a thing. Sports psychologist is interesting to me. It's probably the one I know the least amount of about on this whole list. They work with sports teams and athletes to help improve individual performance, team performance, build cohesion among teammates. Sometimes people are really good at their sport, but they don't play well with their teammates. So they try to help, that issue. Um, there was a UFC fighter, a big UFC fan, and back old school UFC, there was a guy named Diego Sanchez that was on this tear. I mean, he was killing everybody, and then all of a sudden he just kind of started sucking. Just had several losses in a row to people that were kind of like he had a loss. Okay, it happens. So they gave him a little bit easier opponent for his next fight because I think he was a big draw and they didn't want to lose him, and he lost that one. So they gave him just some tin can, some guy that he easily should have been able to beat, and he lost again. And it's like, oh my God, what happened to this dude, right? So then all of a sudden he comes out for his next fight, and he's like, as he's walking, he's going, yes, yes, just over and over again. It's so strange. Well, he basically he watched the Tony Robbins special that's like a self-empowerment thing, and went to a sports psychologist who like really amped up his motivation, and what had happened was he was advancing faster than most people in the field, and he was just almost becoming in a league that where people just couldn't touch him. And he kind of got complacent, and he just thought, nobody can beat me. And then he lost, and he rationalized it, and he thought, I had an off night. And then he lost a second time, and he thought, I'll get it back together for the next fight. But, then he didn't. Well, now you run into that self-doubt. You're like, well, maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was. Maybe I'm never going to win again. So he was all kinds of messed up. So he went to a sports psychologist, and they got him back on track, and he did quite well after that. So I guess that's what they do. I don't know how you get into that field. I mean, it's mostly you're kind of just a coach, like a consultant, coach consultant. But anyway, I don't know if they require any kind of license or anything. Again, I'm not real. I don't think that would be my cup of tea at all. I'm not good at motivating other people, so I don't think I'd be very good at that. And then the last one here is the health psychologist, and this is a psychologist that deals primarily in medical setting, but with mental issues. So somebody that maybe has, say, like fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia is a neurodegenerative disorder, and it causes just sort of fatigue and kind of a chronic, non-localized pain, particularly in women. And women have struggled with this and have a hard time with it, and you might go to a health psychologist that would help you deal with because it's incurable for the most part. So they would help you kind of deal with the fact that this is what your life is going to be like. They might deal with people that get a diagnosis of some terminal disease, right? Clearly, you're going to be depressed, and no psychologist in the world is going to therapize that. The depression away, right? If you're terminally ill, but they could probably help you with it. They could ease that transition a little bit. So they work with that, and family members, people that are dealing with that, people that have lost a limb, and they have to now get used to life as a paraplegic or a quadriplegic. If you have that kind of issue, anyway, you see what I'm saying. They deal with those victims, if you will, of health tragedies, and we'll work with them quite extensively. So they work in hospital settings usually. Very often hospitals will have a psychologist on staff. The other thing is sometimes people come in with medical complaints and they do tests and there's nothing medically wrong with them. So they have a psychosomatic disorder or a somatoform disorder, which again, that's a late chapter we'll talk about. But the problem's not physical, the problem is up here. So they have a psychologist that will come in and talk to them. So, all right, that pretty much ends the chapter. That was longer than I anticipated, but there's a lot of meat in these chapters. If depending on how deep you want to dig. So I'm gonna try to do this again. It's not my favorite format. I'm used to feeding off people and answering questions and pacing the room. It's so weird for me to sit for this long and look into a little dot on the top of my computer. But anyway, give me some feedback. Let me know if this is helpful, if this is more than you needed. If nobody's watching them, I'm going to stop doing them because I'm not doing them for my health. But if you guys think that it's helpful and you liked it, then let me know that somehow. Shoot me an email. Tell me that, and I'll keep doing them. If I don't hear anything back, then I'm not sure I'm going to do this for 16 chapters. So we'll see. But anyways, let me figure out how to stop this, and we'll talk to you guys later.